Dan Bublet's Comedy Productions.
My friend Dan, he's got a podcast, 'cause all comics need a podcast, and nobody had a podcast called The Art of Bombing. So Dan went out and bought a tape deck. Who knows why he bought a tape deck? Now podcasts don't get played on tape decks, but Dan is from the 80s. So hey there, all you funny jerks, come talk to Dan about your work. Tell him all about your worst times. It's The Art of Bombing. Welcome to an all-new episode of The Art of Bombing presents Between Bombs, Callbacks, where we call back the previous episode. This week we are calling back episode 268 with Ricky Ramos. With me, as always, my co-host, producer, Mr. Josh Shirley. You got the Bister back.
Yeah, thank you. And you stuck the landing on Ricky Ramos.
I appreciate that. I
you know what? And if it's Ramos, it's his fault because he can't fill out the form and say how the phonetic spelling works. Sorry, Ricky. But look, guys, this is take 39, and we finally got it through. Dan said Ricky Ramos a whole bunch of different other ways. And,
I did.
Was not happy about it.
I was not. We had to reset.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's right.
And that's the great thing about podcasting. If we didn't call ourselves out, you wouldn't know because I just edit that out and do a reset.
Right.
This
Yeah,
ain't
it's a
live.
little look behind the scenes, guys.
Yeah,
a little
that's right.
blooper reel for you. Look, today, one of the things that I thought we could backflip into off this after listening to this episode was the core elements of a joke. Because it seems to me that things get lost as we start to, get better and we start to go through comedy. We have this sort of dummy curve idea where, like, in the very beginning, I could do some things right and I don't know it. But the more I learn, like, I forget some of the fundamentals that should be there. And in his bombing story, he talks about how he's being true to himself with this edgy material. And let's face it, we're talking about an edgy guy, former gang member, former drug addict, ex-con. he's got, like every reason, like you can't get hired at Wendy's. He's had it, right? And, he's essentially drawing from that for his material, as he should. But what he says was, look, I went into it. I made the audience really uncomfortable and I couldn't win them back. So I thought, well, there must be something fundamental that got lost there as he began to grow as a comic. What was it? And it sounded like a relatability. So if we write relatability down as one of the core components of a joke, Dan, what do you think the other ones are?
Well, I think obviously relatability that's going to be the main core. I think all your material has to be relatable, but I also think other elements of a joke. Obviously you need your setup, you need your punch. The elements are essentially our structure. You need setup, punch, tag. You got to have, it's got to be a topic. It's got to be your perspective on a topic, because that's one thing with comedy, especially when you're talking about material, is, people will say, well, that's a hacky premise, or that premise has been overused. And at this point in humanity, every premise has been overused. I don't think and if you talk to veteran comedians, they'll even say there's no such thing as an original premise. It's, coming up now, it's more focusing on an original perspective and an original look at that premise, giving your perspective, your point of view, your voice to whatever it is, So that's another element of a joke that's important, is finding your perspective on that joke and your way of telling it. And, and I think personally for me, and I'm more of a storytelling comic, I think that's one thing that why I'm attracted to storytelling and storytelling comics is because, you can't really, sure, things that happen are going to be, part of those premises. But when you're talking about things that happen to you in an observational way, it's not the same as just doing like a dating app joke, like a Tinder joke, like a Tinder one-liner. You're talking about your experience versus just making a silly, funny joke about whatever it is, or an observation. And that's another way going into the being relatable. When you're talking about your experience, people can then relate to that experience, especially if it's on a popular thing such as dating, parenting, whatever the topic may be or the premise. If they can relate to it, they're going to have a better time.
Yeah. So we've got a clear topic or clear premise. We have your point of view, your perspective on that premise is 2. We've got making it, relatable is 3. What else?
I think trying to keep it as original as possible. I mean, yeah, we talk about there not being an original premise, but that also kind of goes into, you want to have the originality, and that's kind of a combination of, having your perspective on it, but trying to, have some originality into it. I feel like it's easy to just copy the same thing as everybody else, if that makes sense. I mean, it is kind of a repeat of what we're saying, but, having
somebody, if you add the 2 things together, that's going to have to be, it's original, your perspective on a topic. And, a lot of topics can be very obscure, if not completely original.
Yeah. I would say structure would be the next thing. So it would be, finding a topic, making it relatable, and then giving your perspective, your point of view, and then giving the joke structure. And that's what we talked about earlier, your setup, punch, tag.
Setup, punch, yeah.
Tag.
Setup, punch, tag.
If you're doing it as a story, it's going to be, you're going to have a story, but within that, you should have some setup, punches, tags, or what I call, in a story, when I'm writing a joke that's more of a story, I don't really call them setups and punches. I mean, you will have setup there, and you do have punches, but I call them more laugh lines because to me, it's like I'm writing a story, so it's like essentially my laugh line is a punchline, but it doesn't necessarily fit the standard mold of just a one-liner joke with a setup punch. Yeah.
Sure. I do some stories as well, and you're right. There have to be sprinkled in these punches or these laugh lines because, but essentially the story itself is what's providing the other pieces of it. Mm-hmm. So the setup is all contained in the story, and so that's why it can be difficult to make a story into a comedic routine and not have it be, well, I guess you had to be there.
Exactly. That's a great point. And and that does happen a lot with people who try to do storytelling where they're just telling the story because they think it's funny or amusing, however it happened, and they don't really punch it up. And it just, again, like you said, it becomes that, well, you had to be there or you just had to tell it better.
Yeah.
And that's the thing too, like while you're stemming stuff from truth and a story, especially if it's your own experience, it's coming from truth, but it doesn't mean you can't exaggerate it. I mean, I feel like every story I try to tell on or even any joke at some point kind of stems from some portion of my reality, but doesn't make it necessarily true. Like I have a joke. I've had people ask me if I told a joke, and I've had people after a show ask me if that joke really happened, and I'm like, not exactly, but it stemmed from some truth.
Totally.
It's like, no, it didn't happen exactly how I told it, but definitely comes from some truth.
Right. And just to segue over to relatability as one of the components here. So there's 4 of them that we uncovered. It's got to have structure. It has to be relatable. There has to be a clear premise and your original point of view on that premise, or your point of view plus the premise equals some, factor of originality. So we got those things. When we build from that, into relatability, or we take a piece of relatability. Ricky says in the episode something that I thought we could unpack here, which is, I was going out and I was doing my edgy material and people weren't necessarily with me. And he probably saw some inconsistency with that. He probably was in front of people that he knew or were used to hearing jokes like that or other comics the first few times he did it. And then he got in front of a real audience with a mixture of different people with different backgrounds. And he specifically says that.
Yep. And all
of a sudden it didn't work.
Yeah.
So just to drive through to my question, like he then says, well, I got to take and divide it up into these little consumable, relatable, everyday pieces. Or I have to have some everyday factor to it in order to make it relatable. Do you have any idea what he meant by that?
Oh, I think it goes into, I think part of that is, breaking it up, like you said, breaking it up into consumable chunks and relatable chunks is, taking like, like doing maybe comparisons, comparing what it's like to be an ex-con to working at a job or being in a marriage, I guess would be a better comparison. It's, because people will say ball and chain and that kind of thing, or, making that kind of a comparison where you can take that background that not everybody necessarily has experienced and apply it to another background, or another thing that most people would, and I think that's a good example of that, being in jail. You can compare, it is hacky. I'm not saying it's the most original premise, but you could take, as an example, it's a great example. You can take being, in jail and compare that to being married and make those comparisons.
Yeah.
And then that's the connecting point where you take your experiences that might not necessarily be relatable to everybody, but you put them into a consumable chunk that people can then relate to.
Yeah, there you go. Nice. Yeah, that's really well defined.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that we to think about that stuff too, because I don't know. I guess when I write jokes, I just write jokes, and when you are writing jokes, you should think about some of this stuff. I mean, obviously, you should just write your stuff and try to make it funny, and do the whole don't put constraints on yourself, but having a little bit of forethought about stuff like that can definitely come in handy. And you see this same thing happens with, kind of what he was talking about. You see this happen with comics who start off by doing bringer shows where they're performing for just their friends. And then they go do a real show where their friends aren't there. And then they just bomb because their jokes, weren't good, or they were only relatable to their friends. That's why it was funny, because it goes back to you had to be there. Well, it just so happens the audience was there, so it was funny to them.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like for jokes like this, if we pluck out and just keep focusing on this one element of relatability, I find that when a joke has the other things but not that, it's inconsistent.
Mm-hmm.
So I get laughs here, I don't get them here. If I start looking around, it's okay. It's missing some factor of relatability. Like, and you gave a perfect example of how you could do that. Mm-hmm. So I think it's about walking it into, okay, well, what components of this would people understand if I change the context? And then as your set progresses, you can use jokes that don't quite have that element to it as much because it's later in your set, so it could be a component of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've already by then established the trust and the likability and all the things you hope to achieve early on in your set. I will say too, with that, going back to what you were just kind of talking about with that's a good way to like when you go back and analyze your sets. When you're looking at your material and you see that happen where you have a joke that's inconsistent, that's a pretty good way of indicating that there's not enough relatability. It's not relating to everybody. So like just taking that as its own little, way to analyze your jokes is huge, because you're right. That's a great observation. Having that inconsistency probably means it's not relatable enough. And it's the same thing you hit with not just like being relatable, but having same kind of thing when you do jokes that reference certain things. If you do a reference to something, and you see this especially with older references, things that are just not in the mainstream anymore, or the mainstream pop culture. Not everybody might get it because they don't know what you're referring to, and same kind of thing happens. You got to make sure if you're doing some kind of a joke that is using a reference, It's either got to be a joke or a reference the audience based on the demographic and what you can visually see as far as, trying to figure out what the demographic might be that they're going to get, or it's got to be a more modern reference that everybody will get, something that's super in the face of everybody in pop culture.
Yeah. Yeah. And he also, just to close this out, I think a third thing that he mentions that you guys talk quite a bit about is the comfort level or the comfort factor for the audience. What kind of things do you do to make the audience comfortable?
Oh, for me, I mean, I guess I never really thought about whether or not they're comfortable. I make sure they have a nice seat and then, drinks. No, hopefully that's the staff.
Can I get
job.
this out of your way?
I bust their table, ask if they want some food. I'm not actually doing comedy. I'm working.
Yeah, I am a waiter. That is how I do it.
In that scenario, that's how I get paid. Not doing comedy, but by being their waiter. But no, I think one of the things I try to do is to make them, make them feel comfortable is getting them to trust me. And one of the ways that you can do that is doing a little bit of self-deprecating humor. Doing some stuff up top that's more on the ice-breaking side of things, because essentially you're meeting new people. You're not doing full-on introductions where you're getting to know every person's name, but you are meeting new people when you go up. You're meeting this new audience, and just meeting strangers is awkward for everybody. I mean, for a majority of people, find that meeting new people kind of an awkward situation, and so it's nice to have some sort of a icebreaker, and that's what that helps build that trust, and it helps establish likability, and it so again, I start off real light with my set. And I think, because I want that trust, and getting trust, once you have their trust, people are going to be more comfortable with you as well.
Right.
Trust is a big component into somebody being comfortable in a social situation. And comedy essentially is a social situation because while it's only for the most part, it's only a one-sided conversation, it is conversational. And the people in the audience do have an active role of listening and responding. And if they're not comfortable, they're not going to respond and they're not going to listen. They're going to tune out and things like that. So I think it all kind of ties together with that. What about you? What are things you try to do to make your audiences feel more comfortable?
Well, I definitely start with some of the same things that you mentioned, right? So doing something relatable, doing something that sort of makes me less okay than them or self-deprecating so that they get into this natural human rescue mode of making me feel okay, right? So they want to lean forward and get engaged and listen to what I'm saying. I've also found that if I can keep the beginning bits more, especially when I'm in a situation where I've got to pull the room together a little more, if I can make the beginning jokes very easy to understand and clear and short, or if there is a part of a longer bit that those things belong to, then making those things in a slower pace. I also, if I'm not gonna at the end, I'll step on laughs and I'll move forward and I'll drive it. In the beginning, I won't. I'll really just let them feel comfortable laughing. I'll hold on. Let them take their time with that so that they see that they're having some effect on me. They're like, okay, I'm laughing at this joke and he's not telling the next one because I'm laughing. I now am an active participant in the conversation. So that's another thing to not forget to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, make them feel involved. Yeah, that's a very good point.
Absolutely.
Before we get out of here we talked a lot about the joke structure, but one thing we wanted to touch on as well, because we talk a lot about it in this episode with Ricky, is show producing. Now, we did a whole 3-part series on how to produce your own show, but we would like to highlight it because, again, it came up a lot in the conversation. Ricky has his own entertainment company called Side Splitting Entertainment. He produces shows all over northern Colorado. If hopefully you listen to the regular episode. I should have brought that up at the very beginning, that you should listen to the episode and then come listen to this. And
Well, it'll make more sense.
It will make more sense. And I need to get better about doing this at the beginning. If you've been listening to all of these callbacks we've done so far, you'll know that I wait till like the middle of the show to mention it. That you need to go listen to the reference material first. It helps. But anyway, we talk about that. But if you did listen to that episode, you know, not only does he, produce shows, he's getting ready to produce his comedy festival. And so we talked a lot about producing on there, and just a few tips on producing, just as kind of a callback to that. And again, you can just go watch the videos if you want, but if you don't want to do that, we just want to kind of touch on that a little bit. What are things, and you are a master because you kind of put that together and facilitated that series. And then you took the information that we shared with everybody and sold out your room doing that stuff.
Yeah, dude, following the rules.
Following the rules. What are the rules that you, out of that? I mean, obviously, we talked a lot about stuff and we don't have time to go into the full depth. But if you could do, what are 5 rules that you would, these are the rules you have to follow to put on a good show?
All right, let's do our best here. I'd say a big one is finding a good venue that's going to participate in the promotion of the show.
Find a partner in a venue.
Yeah,
not a venue.
I mean, because they have a lot of followers. Most times on social, a place like, and most of the time, if you're going to produce your own show, you're not doing it at a comedy club. You're doing it at an alt room situation,
independent
like a
venue,
coffee shop bar.
Yep.
Right. People follow that. People go to the website. People frequent the place, and people are totally on their social, and they get notified when something's going on, and they have channels to do that. And if they know what they're doing, they'll post it on the website, they'll reference it, and they'll put together some kind of social cadence leading up to the show. So that's a piece there. Another one is, it's one. Thank you for keeping track.
One.
So
finding a partner in a venue.
That's right.
Partner in the venue.
Book some comedians that are willing to help you promote. Meaning, they're going to share it with their friends. You don't have to say, look, you have to bring 4 people to be on the show. It's not really about that. It's, you want to be part of this. If you want to maximize your income from this show, then you need to put it on social and give them the tools to do that. So give them a post that they can just use and they don't have to think about. Give them an invite that they can invite their friends to, which is easy to do. Give them a ticket link. Give them videos, all those different types of things. So that's 2. Number 3, I'd say structure the information in terms of how you're advertising the show according to what channel you're using. So a quick explanation for this is, don't try to oversell the show on the first thing somebody sees. So if you're going to put a social post out about it, or if you're going to make a flyer, just hit the most important things. It's a comedy show. It's at this place at this time. As people make their way closer to a buying decision, include more information. So as your Facebook event can contain some info on the comics, but the page they actually click on, like if you're using Eventbrite for the ticket, include videos, press articles, longer bios.
Creating a kind of a marketing strategy or a marketing plan at certain, and I don't know, we didn't really go into that much depth when we did the getting ready for when we did the series, but maybe we could do this as a special episode as well of building kind of a marketing plan where, you talk about, you announce the show. It's got the basic info. Now say you're 2 months out. So you announce the show, and then at 7 weeks you're doing this, 6 weeks you're doing this, and the closer you're getting to the event, the more you're working on your strategy and your plan, with the different marketing, kind of like what you're talking about with having the different elements.
Yeah. The closer, so whether it's your website that you control or if it's an Eventbrite page or something else that you're using to promote tickets, I'd have most of the information closest to the button that they're gonna, if they're gonna make a purchase, try and let them know everything at that point so that they get closer and closer to it to find out about it. And it's closer to where they actually make the decision. So that's 3.
Yep. And just real quick, as a bonus tip, I recommend even if you sell tickets on your website, to use a third party like Eventbrite, because especially Eventbrite, they do a lot of their own marketing. People go to Eventbrite to seek out events. So it doesn't hurt. You're only paying the fees if people buy tickets. So if nobody goes onto Eventbrite and buys tickets, it's not hurting you. You still promote your website, and that's where you promote your ticket sales. But just having it there in the background, people might discover it. And it has worked for me. I sell tickets on my website. Usually do an Eventbrite event as well. Sell a handful of tickets on there. Also sell them on my website. So,
yeah, Dan, 4. I think you stole the thunder on 4. That's a great one. Using multiple ticket links is fantastic. So last show I did, I had a brown paper ticket link running, and they're really behind on paying people. They do pay you, and they have some good syndication that they do to other places. And then there's an Eventbrite link that I use. You can also have 2 Eventbrite links. But the reason I think that's important is because you can track and use different marketing channels that apply to those links. So you gave the example of your website. You could have everything you're giving the vendor, or I'm sorry, the venue to send your way on one ticket link, and you can do all of your promo on another ticket link, or even have a third one that you give to the comic so you can really see where things come from. The point is analyzing what channels are successful when you've got more than one link. So that's definitely worth mentioning. And number 4, I think, should go to that. Number 5, when you're at the show, don't put your weakest comedian up as an MC. The MC really it's their show. They have to know what they're doing. And the biggest mistake I see comics making is to MC the show with a newer comedian who doesn't really understand the point of bringing the room together.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're a new comic and you're going to host your own show, well, good news. It's your show and you're kind of the boss of the show. So if you want to be successful, get an experienced comic to come in and MC the show and give yourself a 5 or 6 minute guest spot until you're good enough to be able to work the room the way that an MC needs to do. That's a really important position, and it's a really overlooked thing.
It's really very overlooked. I totally agree with that. Your MC should almost be one of the strongest comics on the show. And not just as a funny comedian, but because they need to know there's more to, like I said, we've talked a lot about it on this podcast. The MC is a hard job to pull off.
It is. I'd even say the first comic up after that, give them a little bit longer set and have your second strongest comic go first. And you pull the room in. And then, put a couple of comics in the middle and then have your last. I mean, in a professional environment, you've got 3 professional comedians doing it and you can get away with the MC feature headliner combo. But you're not a comedy club.
But even some clubs, especially like if you look at Canada, that's kind of their thing is they take the strongest comedian and they're the MC. And then they do time between, they do their MC stuff. They get the crowd going. They do the thing. They bring up the feature who typically does the time slot of what a MC would do, 10 to 15 minutes. Then they go back up there, do some more time, then bring up the headliner. And then sometimes they even go up and do more time after the headliner,
Yeah, I didn't know that.
And that's because they're the strongest comic on the show. And that's kind of the format they use. So, yeah, definitely keep that in mind. And I think this has been a great callback episode. I think there was a lot of takeaways that I hope we drilled deeper on, and hope you got something from that. Make sure you're following the show wherever you listen to this podcast. If you're not already, subscribe, do the things, check out the YouTube channel. We're putting out more content on there. If you want to fire Josh, you can do so by going to buymeacoffee.com/artofbombingpod. Leave us a little tip in the coffee pot.
And when you do that, have a way I'm fired. Like add some pizzazz to it.
Be creative.
Yes.
Creatively fire Josh. And then what we're doing, you leave a little tip, you leave a little message. I'm going to fire Josh however you guys tell me to fire Josh. on the regular episodes. It's a fun little thing. And so if you want to fire Josh, that's what you do. buymeacoffee.com/ourbombingpod. You'll see the promotion on there. All right, I think that's going to do it for this callback. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
This has been a Dan Bublitz comedy production. Roar.